Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into some competitive decks that I think could be a good start for you if you're new to MTG Arena and you're looking to build your first deck. Now, these decks will have a variance of, costs when it comes to the amount of rare, common, uncommon, and mythic wild cards. But I tried to get some of the cheaper ones that overall had pretty good stats when it comes to playing in the current meta that is happening in MTG Arena. I actually was going to record this yesterday before the bannings happened, so I had to kind of rewrite a little bit of this, so I do apologize for the lack of videos earlier this week. But that being said, let's just kind of dive into each deck and kind of talk about each one and talk about the cost and maybe the win rates and stats against other decks in the meta. Now, the first deck up is going to be Mono Red Goblins. This is actually probably the cheapest deck out of the three decks I'll be going over today. Overall, it is a pretty inexpensive deck as it only requires 4 rare wild cards and then a mixture of probably about, I think it's 16 or 17 uncommons and the rest commons, and it does also play Snowlands. You can also change out Snowlands with the banning of Faceless Haven. I actually was keeping the Snowlands in there if you want to go towards Faceless Haven, but if you want to swap out Faceless Haven and maybe go for the 1-mana shock spell instead of maybe Frostbite, you can also do that option, leaving you like an avenue to maybe upgrade to add in Den of the Bugbear to the deck. But for the most part, I mean, the deck doesn't really need too much more to really make it work. This kind of is all you really need. You can always just experiment with maybe some of the cards from the Mono Red starter deck that you get with. But overall, this is a pretty effective, pretty aggressive deck. I do think it's a step behind the Mono Whites and the Mono Greens, so those matchups are sometimes more difficult because a lot of the creatures in those decks are bigger than our creatures that we're attacking with. But if you can kind of keep the board clear and kind of ping for these chunks of damage against your opponent, by the time maybe they stabilize the board, it's kind of too late and you've just gone wide against them and can kind of overwhelm them. Now, I've been kind of tracking these on a particular app and kind of getting the win rates of all these decks that I'm kind of showing you today, and I try to get decks that were above a 50% win rate currently in the meta, and this one's sitting around 55%, depending on which version you are playing. And that could always change with the release of the bans and restrictions coming to the format or coming to the arena probably Thursday, I think is when they said. So things can change around, but this is definitely a deck that's not going to be affected in any sort of way. It may actually just get better. But like I said, it's a 55% overall win rate. Its weak matchups are probably against the more aggressive decks in the format, like the Mono Whites and Mono Greens, like I said, because the creatures are bigger. And it actually is more favored in matchups where like your opponent's playing a slower deck, like a mid-range deck or control deck. So definitely a deck that can kind of overwhelm your opponent before they can really stabilize the board and whatnot. But that being said, I mean, the deck isn't expensive when it comes to also the overall curve of the deck. It's a 1-2-3 style deck, nothing more than 3. So you start off with your 1-drop Fireblade Charger. It's a 1/1 for 1, and then when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. If you get some buffs on it, it can become stronger and deal an extra damage. Frostbite works amazing as a decent 1-mana removal for 2 damage, and if we have our 3 Snowlands out, we can do 3 damage to any target instead at 1 mana. Goblin Javeneer is a great 1-mana 1/1 haster, and whenever it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to target creature blocking it, so definitely a good aggressive creature that we want to maybe try to have early in the game. Then from there, we have Battlecry Goblin. This is kind of like the key goblin, kind of makes our board get very wide very quickly. It's a 2-mana 2/2 goblin. You can spend 2 mana, and goblins we control get +1/+0 and gain haste. And then it has this Pack Tactics ability, which is kind of like if you attack with creatures with power 6 or greater. You create a 1/1 red goblin token that is also tapped and attacking as well, so it helps us get wide against our opponent. Hobgoblin Captain, a 2-mana 3/1 with Pack Tactics. Whenever Hobgoblin attacks, if you attacked with creatures with power total 6 or greater this combat, it gains First Strike, which is also very good, especially if you're trying to be aggressive. First Strike is great because a lot of creatures don't have it, especially in the 2-drop slot. So this is definitely something that kind of gets around maybe other pesky creatures that could be out at 2 mana. Then we have Royal Eruption, which is a great removal spell for 2-mana sorcery. It deals 3 damage to any target, so it can also be dealt to your opponent's face, especially if they're starting to get low. And if we have the additional mana, we can actually tap 7 total mana, and it deals 5 damage instead, so that's also a very good way to possibly finish out the game with 1 big damage spell to the face. Then Thunder and Rebuke, just because it's another 2-mana removal spell that deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Like I said, there's a lot of big toughness creatures in the format, and having something that deals 4 damage to that creature is definitely be very good and kind of help us stabilize the board if our opponent puts out a 4 toughness creature against us. Then we have You See Your Pair of Goblins. This is a very interesting card as it has 2 different abilities. We can choose one of them depending on the game situation. For 3 mana, instant speed, we can have our creatures control get +2/+0, so allowing us to attack in more aggressively. And then we also can befriend goblins, and we can create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield, allowing us to get wider and maybe set up for a finish and attack the following turn. It's also instant speed, so we can play at the end of our opponent's turn and then allow us to attack immediately with those goblin tokens we also created. Then is our Hobgoblin Lord, our Bandit Lord. It gives all our other goblins +1/+1, and then for 1 red mana, we can tap it, and it deals damage equal to the number of goblins that had entered the battlefield under our control this turn to any target, so we can do it to the face. You can combine this with, you see a pair of goblins, maybe at the end of your opponent's turn, if you didn't attack with your Goblin Lord. Ping them for 2 points of damage for 1 mana, definitely very good. So pretty decent card that has some utility in case, depending on the situation. And then we have Hulkin Bugbear. It's a 3 mana 3/3 haster. Just a decent 3 mana vanilla kind of card with haste. Deals 3 damage. Combine that with Hobgoblin, it's going to swing it for 4 damage, which is definitely very good. And just overall, like I said, this deck is just trying to overwhelm your opponent with a bunch of small creatures, get wide, deal a lot of damage, and it plays 23 snow-covered mountains. Like I said, because Faceless Haven's now banned, you could always swing back to regular playing basic red mountains, though you would have to swap out the Frostbite as well, and then you can always upgrade into like Den of the Bugbear, and probably want to do like about 3 copies and cut back 3 lands in total. Would probably be a good fair trade. And if you go back to basics, you don't have to worry about also keeping snow mana for the Frostbite. You can then play like a 2 mana shock spell. There's a couple depending on what the situation is, like the one you deal damage to the opponent's face. You can scry as well. You can just play regular shock, or you can play the other one. I think if you deal 2 damage to target creature, it gets exiled instead of going to the graveyard. So definitely some options you can kind of flex around depending on what kind of version you want. With that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's kind of talk about it. Now, the next deck up on the list is another aggro deck. The common theme to a lot of these decks are they're mostly on the aggro side to mid-range side. This is more on the aggro side, as a lot of creatures in the deck, yet again, are also very cheap. This is a Selesnya Magecraft deck. It's a very explosive deck because we kind of combine 2 things. We combine very cheap spells, and then we combine the Magecraft ability that came with Strixhaven that allows us to kind of, add counters or just pump creatures whenever we cast a non-creature spell. And then it also plays, just some, other things that we can get some additional creatures if we play multiple spells on the same turn. So overall, a very strong deck that can overwhelm your opponent very, very early. Can be very explosive. You can kind of win on one turn if everything lines up. But nonetheless, a definitely strong deck. This one's a little bit weaker in the overall meta where it kind of lands. It kind of has I think around a 53% meta. Our 53% win rate. It has 10 rares, 2 mythics, 16 snowlands, 8 commons, and 24 uncommons, which can be a lot depending on how many, how much you've been collecting with your wild cards and whatnot. But overall, pretty strong deck. I do think it's kind of like if you don't want to play a tribal deck, this is another deck that you can kind of go around. But overall, like I said, 1-drops are kind of the key focus. You kind of want to find a hand that has, one of your key 1-drops, and then hopefully slowly build up with your 2-drop and then your 3-drop. So the deck plays a card called Clever Luminancer. It's a 1 mana 0/1. It has a Magecraft ability that whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, Clever Luminancer gets +2/+2 into end of turn. So this is, like I said, we play a lot of cheap spells. Combine that with this. If we cast multiples of this can become like a 4/5, 6/7, depending on the situation. So definitely a very potent card, very explosive card. Homestead Courage, it's a 1 mana sorcery spell that puts +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains vigilance, so it doesn't have to tap to attack. And we can flash it back for 1 mana, which is also pretty awesome. Definitely a great card that kind of works very well with this deck. Monk of the Open Hand, this is one of those spells that benefit us from playing multiple spells on the same turn. So whenever we cast a second spell each turn, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Monk of the Open Hand. So therefore, it gets bigger every turn whenever we cast our second spell. Blizzard Ball is a great card for this deck just because, it's a cantrip spell. It allows us to kind of like spot removal something that may be in our way. Also gives our creature indestructible, and also +1/+0 if we have 3 or more snow permanents, which is also very beneficial to us when it comes to playing against our opponent. Charge Through, it's a 1 mana instant speed spell that gives target creature trample to end a turn. So that's like always a tough part with these decks, not trying to get through with that extra damage. And then we also get the benefit of drawing a card, so maybe draw more momentum to kind of like, get more aggressive into our opponent. Then we had Snakeskin Veil. It's a 1 mana instant speed spell that gives target creature +1/+1 counter, as well as hexproof in end of turn. So if your opponent's trying to, pop a spot removal, you can then play Snakeskin Veil. It nullifies the spell that they're targeting the creature with. And it's pretty good overall as a kind of like a way to save our creatures, because that's kind of one of the weaknesses of the deck. If your opponent's playing a lot of, spot removal, like creature removal, it's definitely a good way to take it. That's where we kind of, unfortunately can't really get around when it comes to that. Then the last card is Wild Shape. It's another card that, has some, utility. You can kind of do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, depending on the situation. It's a 1 mana instant speed spell that you get to choose one until end of turn. Target creature control has base power and toughness, becomes that creature type and gains that ability. So you can make it a turtle with hexproof. That's a 1/3. You can make it a spider with reach. That's a 1/5. You can make it an elephant. That's a 3/3 with trample. So depending on the situation, you can change the creature depending on what you need to do with it. Definitely another great protection spell in case our opponent tries to target our creature with the hexproof, or if our opponent's tapped out, we want to be aggressive, we can make our creature base toughness 3/3, and if it has counters on it, it then gets those counters and then some. Or if you do something like a Clever Luminancer with this and then make it a base toughness of 3/3, every spell you play becomes a 5/5, so on and so forth. That makes the creature very, very big, and trample, so it just attacks through things. In the 2-drop slot, we have Clarion Spirit. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that whenever we cast our second spell each turn, you get to put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So flying is a great way to get over things that may be gunking up the actual board. Then we have Leonine and Lightscribe. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with Magecraft that whenever we cast our instant or sorcery spell, creatures we control all get +1/+1 until end of turn. So it definitely is a good way to pump up the team in general to get very aggressive and swing very wide on our opponent and get in for some big damage. Show of Confidence is another cool card that works well with the deck, that when we cast a spell, we copy it for each other instant or sorcery spell we cast this turn, and then we may choose new targets for the copies. And essentially it puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature and also gains vigilance. So one of two things depending on the situation. You can swing in if you cast some things in the your first main phase, then you open for attacks, and depending on what your opponent does, you can then play this spell and then copy it. Though you already made the attacks, maybe your the creatures are tapped, but they can get pumped up in that sense. Or if you think that your opponent's tapped out and they can't really smart removal anything, you can play this on your main phase, give everything vigilance, then go for your attack, and then you don't have to tap things down, and then they all get every time how many times you copy it, you get +1/+1 counters for that. Then you got Dragon's Guard Elite, which is a 2 of in the deck. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with Magecraft, and whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Dragon's Guard Elite, so it itself gets bigger every time we play a spell just in general. And then we can, for 6 mana, we can double the number of +1/+1 counters on Dragon's Guard Elite. Definitely a great card nonetheless. This helps us kind of keep the pressure onto our opponent and doesn't cost a lot to actually put onto the battlefield. And the last card up, and this is like the mythic of the deck, is Mavinda. It's Students of Advocate. It's a 3-mana 2/3 flyer, and for 0 mana we can target an instant or sorcery spell from our graveyard. If a spell that doesn't target a creature you control costs 8 or more, we put in graveyard, exile instead. So essentially what we're using this for is we pay 0 mana, we target a spell in our graveyard, which allows us to play some of our spells that may not have flashback again for 1 mana, and allowing us to kind of keep that momentum going. So we can cast another Wild Shape, we can cast that Snakeskin Veil, Charge Through, Blizzard Brawl. Homestead's Courage has flashback, so we don't actually have to target with that, but we definitely can get some of these spells depending on the situation. And it allows us to kind of cast it again, which is definitely very good. And we can do it on our turn and also on our opponent's turn. So it depends. You can always play around with it. So if you want some sort of Snakeskin Veil on your opponent's turn or Wild Shape on your opponent's turn, you can do something like that. Definitely a very cool card. It is legendary, so you really don't need to have any more copies. 2 copies is probably enough because you want to draw your bottom end of the deck instead of really this. This kind of helps us finish out the game overall. Then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We are playing some snow manas. 9 snow-covered plains, 9 snow-covered forest, and then 3 copies of the Pathway land. It's not a very land-heavy deck. 20 lands is probably good enough, just because yet again it's another low to the ground deck. If we get like 4 or 5 mana, that's probably more than enough. If we get more than that, then we're flooding. So definitely a deck that doesn't need to really draw lands. So definitely a good deck. And like I said, its weak matchup is against any decks that really have some sort of direct spot removal. But overall, pretty fun deck if you're looking for something that can just be explosive and swing it on your opponent in 1 turn. Now, this last deck is actually probably the most expensive deck when it comes to overall cost. I believe coming in at a total of 8 commons, 16 uncommons, 16 rares, and 5 mythics, and 15 snowlands. So definitely a very expensive deck, and that is Dimir Zombies. The one benefit is I actually already have done a budget version of this deck. So if you don't have the wild cards to craft this version, I do have a budget version, which I'll have linked in the description below, as well as all the other decks you may have seen in this video. But essentially the goal of the deck is it's another tribal deck, so we're just trying to take advantage of playing zombies that benefit with other zombies on the battlefield. And then we're also playing a cool mythic that's in the deck called Necroduality. It's a 4 mana enchantment that whenever a non-token zombie enters the battlefield under our control, we can create a copy of that creature, so we get an additional copy. So everything is definitely going to benefit from that. Getting an extra copy of something like Champion of the Parish, triggering another +1/+1 counter on target on Champion of the Parish whenever a zombie enters the battlefield, definitely very good. Tainted Adversary, awesome card. We can also dump mana into it if we draw it in the late game, allowing us to kind of create these 2/2 decayed zombies that just get very wide on our opponent, and also combine that with Champion of the Parish, can pump up Champion of the Parish very good. Just a bunch of various stuff, and I'll kind of go through the cards in a little bit more detail, but just a very fun tribal deck that has a lot of cool synergies. You know, this is kind of like the one deck that kind of benefited from Crimson Vow and also, you know, Innistrad just in general, just because Midnight Hunt kind of started like the zombie tribal, and Crimson Vow kind of like added more things to kind of make it at least into something. Overall, the deck, you know, is a pretty decent win rate. I believe this one is also around like 55% currently. Definitely a fun deck, a very strong deck. It's definitely one of those decks that can just overwhelm your opponent once we kind of get Necro Duality out. We can kind of copy our zombies. We're starting to create 2 zombies, you know, for the cost of 1, which is definitely very good there. You know, it plays a lot of cool things. Champion the Parish is kind of like, hopefully we get this on turn 1, and then every zombie we play after this just gets a little bit bigger and bigger. We have Shambling Gas for either, you know, some removal with giving a target creature -1/-1, or we can also search the body whenever this dies. Priest of the Haunted Edge is kind of one of the decent, you know, way to kind of block some aggressive creatures in the early game. Then we can tap it and sacrifice it and give target creature -X/-X, where X is the number of snowlands we control. Definitely a good spot removal spell to kind of get around, you know, maybe indestructibility. Tainted Adversary, like I said, it's a 2-mana 2/3 with Death Touch, which is also very good. You know, your opponents don't really want to attack into something with Death Touch unless they have like First Strike or Flying. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we can play 3 additional mana any number of times as long as we pay it. We get to put that many +1/+1 counters on Tainted Adversary, and then we create twice that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens with Decay. Then those decayed zombies, you know, die when they attack. Definitely, you know, a card that just, you know, gets the board very wide very quickly. Blade-Shot Zombies, kind of like our, you know, Zombie Lord, giving all our zombie creatures +1/+0 to make our zombies just a little bit stronger when it comes to attacks. Skull Scab is a 2-mana 2/2. Whenever a creature we control exploits a non-token creature, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So another creature that helps us kind of, you know, ramp up our tokens. Geralf Visionary Stitcher is a 3-mana 1/4. Gives our zombie creature tokens flying, and we can sacrifice another non-token creature, create an XX blue zombie creature token. X is the sacrifice creature's toughness. So definitely a card that, like, you know, if our opponent direct removals like a Priest of the Haunted Edge or a Tainted Adversary or something like that, we can in response sacrifice it to this and then get a zombie regardless. So kind of like, you know, we still get a creature out of it, and our opponent maybe used a direct removal spell or some sort of removal spell to try to remove it, and it nullifies it. Archghoul the Throbbing, it's a 3-mana 3/2. Whenever it dies or a zombie control dies, we get to look at the top card of our library. If it's a zombie card, we can reveal it and put it into our hand. If we don't put that card into our hand, we may put it into our graveyard. So just definitely a good card to kind of keep momentum going, you know, looking for more zombies. Spell Stinger, that's a 3-mana 3/2 with that touch, with the exploit ability that we can exploit a creature. Target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Combine that with, you know, Skull Scab, it's definitely a good synergy. So we can exploit another creature. We get a 2/2 zombie out of it, and then we also get this draw effect out of it. Headless Rider is a 3-mana 3/1. Whenever it or another non-token zombie we control dies, we get a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Just another way to, you know, keep pressure on the board. And definitely if our opponent plays some sort of board wipe and removes all our creatures, all our non-token creatures, will get a replacement zombie for that board wipe, which is definitely good as well. I kind of already went over Necro Duality. It makes this deck just that much more aggressive. Just creating extra copies of all our non-token zombies that we enter the battlefield under our control. Overcharged Amalgam is a 4-mana 3/3 flash flyer with the exploit that whenever it exploits a creature, counter target spell, activate ability, or triggered ability. So essentially what is happening with this deck is that this deck plays a lot of creatures that, you know, have also other spell effects in them. Like this one is more of our counter spell in the deck. You know, Spell Stinger's like our draw effect. Spot removal a little bit here. You know, Death Touch is also spot removal. So definitely, you know, a couple of various things that kind of, you know, overwhelm our opponent in that way. And then, like I said, we're playing Snow Mana here. 7 of the snow-covered islands, 9 of the snow-covered swamps, 4 of the pathways, and 4 of the ice tunnels. Overall, definitely a very aggressive deck, also decently mid-range deck. So even if the game goes long, this deck does pretty well to kind of finish out our opponent. It doesn't need to win in the first few turns. With that being said, I mean, you know, these decks are all pretty awesome. You know, I'll leave links for each one of them in the description below. If you like this video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.